Okay, so this is a brief audio review of Chapter 4, Code of the Street, the Mating Game. Okay, so he talks about the issues of teen pregnancy in the neighborhood, but he makes sure that you understand why it's something that's happening. So basically, the context is very important here. And teen pregnancy does not make sense in larger society, because in larger society, being a teen mom is heavily frowned upon, but Anderson argues that this is different from members of street families. So using rational choice theory, this argues that we make choices to commit crimes or not based on weighing the pros and cons of specific crimes. So when it comes to pregnancy, it's not a rational choice for most young women to become mothers because it'll lower their status and make their lives more complicated. But it does make some sense in the world of the code. In a situation where you don't have any status, being a mother can be a large boost in status for a young woman. So their outlook is affected by their perceived options. If young women see no outlook for the future, it makes sense that having children would not be put off for the future. So again, the social context matters. So when it comes to decent family expectations, these largely mirror middle-class society. So they would expect their daughters to not have sex, not have children before, they're adults, before they're married. And so decent is an organizing principle. It dictates their experiences and helps them shape their choices. So this is why decent parents often go out of their way to isolate their kids from street kids. And they understand that their kids need to be somewhat streetwise in order to protect their safety and navigate the neighborhood. But they also understand that being streetwise risks their decency, meaning that they can be seen as not decent anymore in that street decent divide. So youths are at risk of being lured into street culture, no matter how vigilant their parents are. So it's important to have role models that can reflect what's expected in the society, but positive role models that emulate the behaviors that decent parents want in the culture are hard to come by. The people that have the highest status are often street-oriented, right? So this kind of presents an alternate model to the model that the decent parents are trying to promote, whether it's to promote to their sons to, respect women, to, take care of children if they have children, to their daughters to, refrain from unprotected sex or things like that. Those role models that should be there are being replaced by street-oriented role models. Also, the issues of persistent poverty and low job prospects. This is the reality for youth. So it shapes their expectations of the future, right? Most people, if they're making a rational choice about having children, they postpone having children until they have an education, until they have some stability in their lives. Then they find it to be the appropriate time to have kids. But think about it. What if you're not going to go to college? What if you're not going to get a better job? What if you think you're not going to live past 25? What's to stop you? Right? So it's the perception that people have of being trapped, of being isolated, alienated, having no prospects that kind of allows for this to happen. So again, when it comes to the role models, there are those traditional role models that are emulating what the decent-oriented want them to emulate. So there's the old heads, which are the epitome of decency. They play this role of the surrogate father. And as we discussed before, decent-oriented fathers really think that it's not just their kids that are important, it's all the kids in the neighborhood. So they do their best to be a positive role model to every kid, and they understand the racial implications of stereotypes against these young men. So they really want to counter those stereotypes of men being hypersexual, of being irresponsible, not taking care of kids, and things like that, by trying to model the opposite, right? So there's also other role models in the neighborhood. The Robin Hood drug dealers. So often kids are lured to see street people as role models because some dealers will help out the impoverished. So, there was an example I was giving you in class about this film, The House I Live In, that talks about this issue of Robin Hood dealers, where this guy basically says that, when he was a kid, he had almost nothing and his parents were struggling, but this drug dealer bought him and all his friends, brand new shoes, which gave them more social status in their neighborhood. And when people asked them how they got those shoes, they pointed to the drug dealer and said, he got it for us, right? And then so after a while, he convinced them to sell drugs for him. basically by saying, oh, you want your own sneaker money? Then just sell these drugs for me. And the guy in the film says, like, I told him I didn't know how to sell drugs, and he said, it's fine. You just stand on that corner and I'll send people to you. Right? So it just kind of shows how Robin Hood dealers, they are often helping people pay their rent, helping people keep the roof over their head, doing things that seem very selfless. But in a way, it's really just a way to ensconce their power and to make sure that these kids are then under them and under their control, right? So it's as much as it's quote unquote a role model, it's a very negative sense of a role model because they diminish the dangers of the drug market and the consequences, and they really play up the financial incentives to kids that are oftentimes literally on the brink of, starvation in dealing with so much poverty. So obviously, it's pretty easy when someone's waving money in front of your face to fall for that. So the street-oriented then see those old head, kind of more traditional role models as no longer relevant. So they see him as a thing of the past. And they think that his experiences don't reflect their world. And so this is what's interesting, is because one of the powers of this role model was that he was able to get people jobs. Like, he had the connections. He knew the people, right? Like, so let's say he's the foreman of the construction company. He's able to get people decent jobs that pay decent money. That's kind of part of his strength as a role model. But the less financial influence that he has, the less ability he has to actually pull people out of poverty, the less relevant he becomes. And so this is something that becomes more and more important as these traditional role models diminish. There's also, positive, decent-oriented female role models in the neighborhood, also rare, and also less found as demographics and economic change takes place, and a lot of these women are forced to be single parents and aren't able to kind of show the role that they want to portray that reflects more of middle-class society. So when you talk about the social context of teen pregnancies, this is a cultural manifestation of persistent urban poverty, as we discussed, right? When there's no jobs to sustain people, that denies an essential part of manhood, right? So meaning in our culture, we have very narrow ways in a patriarchal system for men to prove that they're men, right? So typically the more legitimate way in society that's promoted is men to have economic power that shows that they're men, meaning you have a nice house, you have a nice car, right? You have some sort of status that comes from that financial place. But because of deindustrialization and all the jobs leaving, because of the fact that nothing replaced it, it means that men are only able to then prove themselves through the other two ways we let men prove themselves. Through sexual prowess, which is, having sex with as many people as possible, or through displays and use of violence, right? So obviously, if there were good jobs, if there was a way for people to prove themselves in a different way, they would, right? So motherhood is another part of this context, is that motherhood is a rite of passage to adulthood for everyone, right? If you're 15 or if you're 50 when you have a kid, it's a passage into adulthood, right? So it's basically a situation when you think about the kind of status that you have. When you have a rite of passage, that's something that often can boost your status because you're now a part of the club, right? So it's kind of obnoxious on my social media feeds, right? All my friends that are like, I didn't know what life was. Now I'm a mother and I know, because now I know what love is, and like all these kind of like hokey crap. But there is a societal context to that, right? That we do give more value to mothers as a group than to women, individually that aren't mothers. Actually, if you get to a certain age and you aren't a mother, we think you're weird, right? We make women make excuses for why they haven't had kids, things like that. So it's interesting that for these young women, that they don't have any ways to bring themselves up to raise their status. Think about it. It's not like they're going to raise their status by being a college degree earner, by getting a good job, right? So the only way they can raise their status is by becoming mothers. So another context of this is the role of religion and fate in childbirth. So many use their faith to understand and navigate these experiences, which then kind of, again, explains why this is happening. And again, there's an importance of role models to show and model for youth what a successful, decent life can bring, as it's a check against the power of the street. But since there's a lacking of positive role models, there's a lacking of those representations for people to see in their lives. Okay, so when it comes to the sexual codes of inner city youth, The basic sexual codes, right, have to do with the social, economic, and personal consequences of sexual activity that varies by social class. Meaning that dating is affected by your social class. The richer you are, the more controlled your dating is. It's very unregulated for poor youth, largely because parents are often working a lot, so they can't be there to like meet the person taking their child out on a date, or kind of be there to manage, especially if you're a single parent, you're working multiple jobs. How are you going to keep on top of your adolescent's dating habits, right? So social class is a big impact here. And this is something that's interesting, that these two opposite drives he talks about. This is a consequence that's actually reflective of the entire society, meaning the goals of men and women in the hookup culture are very different. Women are looking for someone to rescue them financially from the perilous financial situation that they're dealing with, someone that could support them, someone they could have a family with, while men are looking for sexual conquest, right? They're looking to prove to other men that they're men. So in this system, there's winners and losers, right? The women lose, the men win. So part of this is, the game and the dream. So peer groups are important to our socialization and our values when we're young adults. And when it comes to objectification, young men learn to see young women as targets instead of people. They care very little about the consequences that their actions might have on the social lives of these young women. Because something that, he really points out in the chapter is that it's not as if all these teen moms have teen dads. It's often men in their 20s, mid-20s, like 25-year-old man knocking up a 16-year-old, right? So meaning that if this is a much older guy with a young teen girl, he knows what he's doing, right? He knows that he's manipulating a girl. And so it just becomes this object of a game, her body and her mind. Meaning it's not enough to get her to have sex with you. The goal is to get her to basically fall in love with you, to think that you're, going to save her and be this white knight and rescue her. And why do women think that? Because men lie to them. They literally manipulate that. They know what the young women are looking for. So they tell these young women, like, oh, I know I've slept with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, but you're different. You're special. You're different, right? And so as a result, a lot of these young women really believe that these men are going to stay with them and be with them. And this just has everything to do with how brain development works, right? The frontal lobe of the brain doesn't finish forming until 25, so you have lower decision-making capabilities at younger ages. This is why we have an age of consent, meaning that before the age of 18, you can't consent to sexuality, just sexual activity, because you're not brain developed enough to really understand the consequences of what you're doing. So it makes sense that it's not, that it's an adult man manipulating a child into having sex with him, because it's the manipulation aspect that makes it possible, right? Telling her, oh, no, girl, I love you. You're special, right? All of these kind of things. And so the game and the rap, right? The rap is just basically being able to say things that manipulate a young woman into having sex with you, right? That's, how good of game you have is basically how many women you can manipulate, right? And so the actual lies you use, the words, that's the rap. So the quality of your game is another place to advance your reputation. So how good you are at manipulating women into sleeping with you can get you more social status among friends, right? So this is playing on the dream, meaning these men that are often, again, adults in their 20s that are dating people that should be in high school, they know that these young women need to escape their social reality. So they play that up in order to control their sexual destinies. So then when it comes to pregnancy, norms of peer groups affect different value systems of teen pregnancy in the neighborhoods, meaning it's common to know a teen mom, so teen pregnancy isn't as abnormal. So the common conception is that young women have various sexual partners, which feeds into the reality that many young men decide to deny paternity. Right? And they just blame the women, like, well, she must have had sex with a lot of people. It's not my kid. When they know that they had unprotected sex with a minor, which is, that's how babies happen. So denying children becomes a common feature, as men are going to be expected to financially provide for kids, and a lot of men want to avoid that responsibility, largely because they cannot actually financially provide for those kids. It's not as if they're just like, well, I could make 80 grand a year working this other job, but I just choose not to, right? It's often because there's just a lack of opportunities. Even if you're working full-time at that minimum wage job, you're not going to be able to provide a roof over the head, the diapers, all of the things that are needed to take care of that child, which again affects their masculinity. So it's easier to preserve your masculine identity by saying, that's not my kid, than it is by trying to take care of the kid and failing. So a context of this is also welfare reform that took place and changed the relationship between parents. Before welfare reform, many women did not list the father of their child, right? Largely because that notion of you can't get blood from a turnip, meaning that if you knew that the guy that was the father of your kid was unemployed, then you're not going to be able to get him to pay child support or financial services, so people would say that they didn't know who the father was, right? But part of welfare reform meant that people had to list the name of the father, and as a result, paternity tests are now used to establish fatherhood. So again, instead of just being able to get the financial support you need because you're broke, you have to now provide, the name or the identification of this person who, if they're working in the underground economy, it's not like they can be taxed or have their pay withheld to take care of those kids, right? Also, the common conception in the neighborhood is that marriage is a trap. So many young women perceive marriage to be a trap that will destroy a young man's life and status in his peer group. So if a father is present, depending on his role models, he may not be a great provider or even grasp the responsibilities that are involved of being a father. So street girls' experiences are different than the decent-oriented girls. They tend to grow up fast and have sexual experiences at a very young age. So without male role models, young women often learn that they gain approval from men via their sexuality. So baby clubs and teen mom support peers are basically, they all have in common that they have children. So that gives them a shared sense of community, and these young women often lack social support and communities in other ways. So being part of that baby club gives them some sort of, identity and community. So there's also this issue that a lot of young women still want to go out and party. They may not want to take care of their kids all the time, so they might often leave them with family members or others so that they can go out and have fun. And again, this is not just reflective of this neighborhood. I mean, if you are like me and wasted many hours of your life watching Teen Mom 2, 16 and Pregnant, all that kind of crap, then like Janelle from Teen Mom was kind of notorious for this, like going and doing a bunch of heroin instead of taking care of her kid. So there is just this element of being young, being impulsive, and not really understanding the full grasp of what kind of responsibilities need to happen in order to take care of children. So the baby clubs build status, right? Young women can get a boost in status when they become a mother, which is one of the most achievable social roles that provide status in the community. So again, back in the 90s, welfare reform changed social support rules, which put limits on and restrictions on services and aid. So this did very little to address the persistent structural poverty that took place as a result of deindustrialization. By putting a time limit on receiving services, the number of people on the program diminished, but the issues of poverty have only increased. So having to prove someone's your child's father in order to receive child support puts a lot of pressures on mothers to name the men and take them to court to prove that they're the father. Then, many don't even receive the child support anyway. So more recent changes to child support have made it harder for deadbeats to get away with not paying, but ultimately you can't garnish the wages of someone who's working in the underground economy. So this also affects the way that women then characterize the men in the neighborhood. So the nothing, this characterization is deadbeat men. And this reminds me of that song No Scrubs by TLC, right? Someone that's all talk, but when it comes to taking care of their kids, they deny them. Like the men that go on Maury and, they've already had like 6 kids attached to them and they're like, no, that's not my kid, right? Versus the good man are those who take responsibility for their kids, and, that includes providing financial support, emotional support, being there for their children. So when it comes to a lot of these young women, there's this intense desire to get back into the dating game. So young women often feel the drive to find another man, which is often at odds with parenting responsibilities. So grandmothers will often step in and take over. As young women maintain their social roles from before they were pregnant, a lot of them become pregnant again within 2 years, right? So that causes even further complications for trying to get out of persistent poverty. So the relationship between men and women changes when a baby is born, right? So boys' mothers often play significant roles in taking care of the kids and being a stable force to trust and help rear the child. And as a result, many men enact the role of father part-time, meaning they parent sometimes, they take care of their kids, but they don't really take the kid overnight, take care of them by themselves that often. They often just buy a few token items here and there. And so this has a lot to do with the peer groups and the pressure to be a dad. So in one way, having a kid is a small boost in status for young men because it's basically proof of sexual conquest, right? But if he takes care of it and he marries the girl, he's often mocked in his peer group. So they want it all. They want the status, but they don't want to have to fulfill that traditional breadwinner role and fail. So some of the basic factors that are related to sex poverty and family life. The first is just youthful ignorance, right? Many young people mess around in a general hookup culture, and they don't think they're going to get pregnant. For many young women in these situations, they don't have access to free or affordable contraceptives in order to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Many young women consent to sex with these men because the comforting lies he tells her about loving her and saving her from financial limitations. And so she believes because they're in love, she doesn't need to have that kind of protection. Also, the culture's receptiveness to having babies can be seen in how normative it is for a lot of low-income youth to have kids. So this is not to say that other teens don't get pregnant, but wealthier teens have better sex education, also have access to contraceptives or birth control, or their parents will pay for an abortion, which can be very expensive. So another factor is that young men need to prove their manhood through sexual conquest. So all of which is exacerbated by persistent urban poverty. So when a teen has a baby, if she's already in poverty, it's much harder for her to get out. And now she has a child, which is expensive, and it keeps her from finishing her education and getting a good job.